Integer has been doing research on trucks, SCR, AdBlue, for over 10 years now. And in order to understand these markets, we carry out some very detailed analysis on the main drivers and on the main obstacles. So the goal of this presentation is to start that Blue Forum looking at the global picture, how different markets are developing, because then afterwards we jump to the Asia Pacific market, and we can place these markets and compare with the other regions. So, as I said, you are mainly familiar here with our conference side. As I said, we also do analysis, research, consultancy. This is some of the publications we run at Integer on a regular basis. The first we usually talk about is the Monitor. That is a monthly newsletter on supply chain developments and other market information for Europe, North America, and Brazil. And then we have a series of forecast services where we look very deep in detail at different markets. Europe, we have it for Europe, for North America, for Brazil, for India, China, and we have just launched South Korean SCR and AdBlue report as well. So if looking at legislation with a lot of depth, then demand now and our 10-year forecasts, supply chain, market shares, and prices. So if you have any questions, just speak to any of us afterwards. To look about at the other regions, instead of ranking and organizing them in a particular order, we've decided just to go let's go west to east, because rankings and volumes change depending on where we're looking at. So let's just start North America, then Latin America, Europe, and then we conclude with Asia and with a global picture. So North America, the main driver for AdBlue consumption is truck sales, and the US and the Canadian markets, they have recovered pretty quickly from the 2008-9 economic crisis. Volumes in 2012-13, they were already very almost at the pre-crisis level. However, there have been 3 years of very high sales, particularly for the Class 8 heavier trucks. So what we started seeing was in 2016, Class 8 truck sales declined, and we were expecting a further a second year of decline in new registrations in North America. This was our initial forecast, which might change slightly. January was very low on sales, but which is quite expected. Every January, sales are typically lower than the monthly average for a year. But for sales in February were already higher than expected. So we would still expect sales to in North America to grow over the next 2 or 3 years, but then not to growing further than what has already been noted in 2015. And one question mark we have is what's going to happen from 2021 onwards, where originally we would expect some pre-buy effect in 2020, as there would be the second phase of greenhouse gas legislation starting in 2021, which is likely to make trucks more expensive and bringing different technologies. Just to have a closer view on that, this is just the Class 8 sales forecasts, and because the class 4 to 7 is a market that grows steadily, and that wouldn't post as many fluctuations as class 8. But as I said, there would be a pre-buying effect expected in 2020 ahead of the second phase of greenhouse gas legislation. But the question now, with the question mark, with the Trump government, where there is a risk of not seeing these all the legislation going ahead. So it's to be watched. But of course, even if sales fluctuate, what is driving AdBlue consumption is the SCR equipped fleet. So the cumulative number of trucks on the market, and based on this, even if sales go slightly down, the AdBlue consumption in North America is forecast to keep increasing. Last year, the market totaled around 2.4 billion liters, which makes it the main consuming market next to Europe. Europe is roughly at the same level. Again, most of the consumption is being driven by class 8 trucks. The class 4 to 7, they don't represent more than 10 or 15% of the consumption. And then off-highway equipment growing steadily with Tier 4 final legislation now fully in place. And the third segment consuming AdBlue in North America is the passenger car and light-duty vehicles, but with the Volkswagen scandal end of 2015, and Volkswagen had around 90% of diesel passenger car sales in North America. And to give an idea of the extent of the impact of the crisis, or of the scandal, in 2015, around 5% of all passenger car sales in the US were diesel. In 2016, the share of diesel engines in passenger cars was below 0.5%. So it's a market that we don't see it developing much further. And there would still be light-duty trucks on diesel, because then it's less from Volkswagen, more from BMW, Ford, and all the OEMs that are not involved with the emission scandal. But for passenger cars, we don't see a much different scenario, and that's why we don't see that volumes for this segment developing much further in North America. And that's our 5-year forecast for the region. So it's a market that mainly driven by heavy-duty trucks, and we would expect volumes to double, to roughly double in 4 or 5 years, and then at some point the growth, the increment decreases just because you start replacing SCR by trucks by SCR trucks. But for most of the, at least for the 5 to 10 year forecast, is a market that keeps increasing its AdBlue consumption. Moving to Latin America, and mainly going to talk about Brazil. There are other Latin American countries that currently use AdBlue as well, but volumes in Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Mexico are still much smaller, and the markets are still in the very first years of trucks with SCR and then requiring AdBlue. But the Brazilian situation is quite interesting. Brazil started selling Euro 5 equivalent trucks in 2012. So now most trucks are equipped with SCR they have been equipped for 5-6 years. The problem is volumes were quite high in 2012-13, but then with the economic crisis and the with the governments stopping skipping their schemes for truck purchase in the country, we started seeing volumes decreasing much quite drastically. To give a number, just to illustrate, the in 2013 there were around 13,000 truck sales per month in Brazil. January and February it was below 2,000 units per month. So the market is 5-6 times smaller than the truck market is 5-6 times smaller than what it was 4 years ago. And added to this, there's also, it's a market where there's a high level of cheating, mainly with through defeat devices, but also bad quality rear, dilution with water, just to make it to make that blue lasting longer. So for Brazil and for all the countries we look at, we brought a concept of the potential market. So the potential market would be the AdBlue volumes in that market if all trucks were using AdBlue as required. But then, because of the level of irregularities, cheating, we deduct what we call the informal market, and then we get to our actual consumption estimate. So volumes in 2016, they were just slightly higher than 2015, even if you were putting more trucks. The SCR fleet increased, but not as much as it could have increased because of very low truck sales. Then there were trucks were being used less. The level of freight activity decreased in Brazil due to the economic crisis. And added to that, you have more trucks adding defeat devices to not use to deactivate the OBD system and not use AdBlue. So, and that's why the growth for the Brazilian market is the outlook is quite pessimistic, and we don't see much. It was a market that at some point was the third main market consuming AdBlue with a huge potential, but now we see moderate growth and not much development. And that's our monthly consumption estimate chart for Brazil from our monitor publication, and we have effectively started seeing some decline in the monthly consumption. So the top numbers are the potential market, what would be consumption if trucks were operating regularly, but then because the informal market is developing and is becoming more and more significant. As I said, the share of what we estimate the share of trucks in Brazil without that is equipped with a defeat device to have reached its 50% now. So half of the trucks are operating illegally. We are seeing consumption, the monthly consumption decreasing when you compare with the previous year. So it's a market where things are not taking off, and we speak to the market on a regular basis, and what everyone says is the market is moving sideways, but it's not going any further. Great. Talking about Europe, Europe is of course more comparable with North America. But then I've got a couple of charts just to illustrate some of the regional differences. We tend to look at Europe as a single market, but there are quite significant differences between among the different European countries. But the main outcome of this chart that shows the level of emission standard, the breakdown by emission standard for each European country, is that some countries that were not too much affected by the economic crisis managed to replace most of its fleet to an Euro 4 level or above. But then for some important markets such as Spain, Italy, Poland, the potential for further replacement is huge, and that's where we're seeing most of the growth in the truck market. Sales in 2016 in Europe were higher than in 2015, and the increment mainly came from countries where volumes had not been too significant in the past. And then we have the passenger car side, which is also developing quite quickly. This chart shows the diesel-gasoline split for in Europe over the past 15 years. And diesel, and the European market is quite different from other markets in the sense that you have at least 50% of new car sales equipped with diesel engines. This percentage reached a peak in 2012, 11-12. You had 55% of new passenger cars equipped with diesel engines. Then it decreases slightly in the following years, and after 2015, Volkswagen scandal. Even if it was mainly North America, there were consequences in the European market. Development of alternative engines, particularly hybrid electric, that now represent 4 or 5% of all new registrations. And finally, a stronger pressure on diesel engines in the main metropolitan areas, with Paris, Madrid, and other cities enacting laws to ban diesel engines from the main urban areas. So last year there was some decrease already. We saw 50% from 52 to 50% of the engines, of the passenger car engines being on diesel. Now we think this share is likely to decrease further, and we expect it to fall to somewhere between 35 and 40% in 5-6 years' time. And this, again, just showing that different countries, the share of Euro 5 and 6 is quite different among countries, and we would expect there's still a lot of room for diesel to see the Euro 6 fleet developing in most of the European countries, which would increase quite significantly the size of the SCR equipped fleet. Combining all these elements and also adding consumption from the non-road mobile machinery segment, we see Europe is very comparable to North America now in terms of current volumes. We also estimate European edible consumption at 2.4 billion liters for 2016. But the market is developing slightly quicker, and we would expect above 5.5 billion liters in 5 years. So it would, again, more than double in terms of market size. Great. There are skip it to India because India, China, Asia Pacific are worth talking in a bit more detail. There are other markets in between, Turkey, Russia. Turkey follows Europe, follows European legislation, and is a couple of years behind. But now Euro 6 is implemented. Russia is on Euro 5 for trucks, but the level of cheating and informality is quite significant. It's likely taking off now. Okay, India is an interesting case. The country has been on Euro 4 for its main cities, but because of the lack of low sulfur diesel, India was still on Euro 3 nationwide, and it has just moved to Euro 4 nationwide a week ago. So now trucks in India any truck and bus sales in India now must meet Euro 4, which means we would start seeing mainly transportation buses, but we'll start seeing some of the heavier trucks also on SCR. But it's a market that is likely to change quite significantly in a couple of years. The government has decided on a move to Euro 6 equivalent in 2020. And our understanding is that the legislation is going ahead. There would be a possibility of pushing back if the fuel quality was not there, but both OEMs and oil companies are expecting to meet the Euro 6 standards from April 2020 onwards. And as a consequence, we would see an AdBlue market developing in India. Volumes said now they're very, very tiny because it's meant for some transportation for urban bus fleets in Delhi and and Mumbai, but we would see this changing, and it's a market that, because of truck volumes, it's a market that can very quickly increase to 500-600 million liters in 5 years. So it's a market to watch and see how things are going to develop. China is in a comparable situation, but China has already implemented. China had a Euro 5 equivalent for Beijing 3 or 4 years ago, and now then that move was implemented in other major cities, and now in July 2017 the whole country is supposed to move to Euro 5. So we would see not all medium heavy-duty trucks, but we would start seeing most of the most new trucks and buses equipped with SCR. And because of urea availability in China, we see trucks doing more, using SCR more intensely than in other regions, in order to improve fuel efficiency as well. And it's a market that, as for Brazil and other countries, there is a quite high level of informalities and cheating, but it's a market that is already at around 600 million liters a year, and this is likely to develop very quickly. And we estimate in 5 years the market would be approaching 5 billion liters per year. Just look at Asia Pacific. The main there are different countries following different steps and different paths in terms of emission standards. So we see most countries follow the European standards, except Japan, who developed its own standards, but they're still very comparable. The main markets in the region are Japan, Australia, and South Korea, and this is likely to remain over the next few years. They're not the other countries where there's some regulatory contexts requiring the use of SCR trucks and buses are much smaller in terms of market volumes. Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, New Zealand. So we estimate the current AdBlue consumption in the region is around 400 million liters. Now, that's our number for 2016. And it's likely to almost double in 5 years. It will reach 800 million liters in 2023 or 4. And then just look at South Korea in a bit more detail. South Korea follows European standards for trucks and passenger cars, light duty, and it follows US standards for non-road mobile machinery. It's now all aligned with Europe and North America, and we estimated AdBlue consumption in South Korea around to be around 100 million liters last year, and this is likely to keep developing, and it will nearly it's a market that is forecast to grow by 15% year on year on average within the next 5 years. Great. So as a conclusion, if we put all these numbers and assumptions together, look at the global picture, we estimate the current AdBlue, the global AdBlue market is around 7 billion liters in 2016, growing. We see this number mainly because of these emerging markets, India, China. We see a growth to beyond 19 billion liters by 2022. But then again, there would be a potential market of 25 billion liters if there were no cheating, irregularities, or people using fertilizer-grade urea to make AdBlue, all this. So it's, we are missing 6 billion liters because of these informal markets. But it's a market that will keep developing. But again, the growth is mainly going to be in emerging countries rather than in Europe, North America, where volumes are going to develop. But they are getting to a point where they are replacing old SCR trucks by new SCR trucks. And then the increment on the AdBlue consumption is much less significant. Excellent. That's